speaker and make it clear.
Order. I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Sure, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my ever-revolving panel of bloggers and opinion shapers, she is from New Zealand's largest feminist blog, The Hand Mirror, commentator and blogger Julie Fairey, and he is a former Green Party MP, well-known social justice activist and political commentator Keith Locke. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, the Supreme Court ruling and solid energy meltdown. What happens with asset sales now? Issue 2, what does the Sky City and Hobbit revelations tell us about how John Key wheels and deals? In Issue 3 tonight, in the wake of the TV3 poll showing National could govern alone, is the Labour Party reshuffle bold enough? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with Issue 1. The Supreme Court have given John Key the green light to start the asset sale program. They unanimously ruled that while the Crown had to consider the Treaty of Waitangi and Māori rights to water, that process could occur after the assets were sold. Meanwhile, Solid Energy has collapsed in value and Finance Minister Bill English admits a valuation write-down. With 3 energy companies about to be brought to market this year, what is left to make of the asset sale process? Julie, how will allowing middle-class New Zealanders to buy shares in assets once publicly owned by all of us, how is that going to deal with New Zealand's inequality issues?
Well, it won't, quite simply put. And the accessibility of these shares to middle-class New Zealanders, I think, is going to be very limited. We know that actually, for all that the share market is reported on every night on the news, it's always on the radio, actually quite a low proportion of New Zealanders own shares already, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of people with the spare cash to be buying into these floats.
Is this mum and dad use of the word mum and dad whenever we just talk about these investors, is that just spin?
I think so, yeah. I think the people who are going to buy these shares are predominantly probably going to be asset management funds, and very quickly we will see that they will end up in overseas hands. If not in the next 2 to 3 years, then certainly sometime after that.
Why should I pay for shares
that you already
in
own?
an asset that I already own? Can you walk me through that? Explain it to me.
And also, why are we selling off things that are income generating? You know, it's just really, everybody knows you don't kill your income. You grow your income. And I was just listening to the results for Air New Zealand on the radio, you know, that they're doing better and better. And that's something the government's got a 75% stake in, and that could well be on the block shortly as well.
We are told that we need to sell these assets so we can build schools and roads and apparently give dairy farmers in the South Island irrigation. Now, I would have thought those schools and roads, that should come out of general taxation, A,
yeah.
And B, if there's an industry who can afford their own irrigation, isn't it the dairying industry? Why is that money going into these things?
Well, I think it's a very cynical ploy to basically reduce the income of the government, which means you have to reduce the spending, which means over time we get smaller and smaller government.
So this is ideologically driven?
I think so, yes.
Keith, Russell Norman has savaged the government's handling of Solid Energy, citing Key's involvement in pushing for expansion into lignite mining in the South Island, minus any business plan. Where does the buck stop for Solid Energy's failure?
Well, John Key a couple of years ago said what a wonderful thing this lignite operation will be, and it's going to reduce all this income stream. In fact, they never even did a business case. It shows the gross level of incompetence, both of the Solid Energy management and of the government through Treasury and that's supposed to be monitoring the state-owned enterprises. Yeah. So the whole thing's a bit of a mess. And selling off Solid Energy, selling off the power companies, you're selling off basic infrastructure in New Zealand. And I think the Christchurch Council has led the way there. It's actually the one council that's kept onto its asset. It owns the port, it owns the airport, it owns the buses, it owns the power company, for example. And they're getting a huge dividend stream, which they're using to keep the rates down. Now, what with the asset sales that the government's envisaging, you're just putting the penalty on future generations. They won't be getting that income stream. It'll all be spent on immediate things to get the government out of a bit of a hole now. to the disadvantage of New Zealand. And things like big energy companies, airports, ports, buses, transport, they are essentially monopoly infrastructure that any private company can make a big lot of money out of because they dominate. And that should be with the public, not with a private owner.
Do you think that Christchurch is going to come under increasing pressure to sell their assets to repay for the rebuild?
Yes, it will, but hopefully it'll stay staunch and just say, well, look, we're getting the dividend stream. That actually makes more economic sense. Plus, we want to be able to control where we go in terms of our, like with the Orion Power Company, which they owned. It did brilliantly in the aftermath of the earthquake in putting everything together, you know, and everyone praised them for that. That's because, largely because it was publicly owned, really.
How do you transition a company like Solid Energy away from dirty coal without sacrificing jobs? Is it possible?
Well, they were getting into biodiesel, and then the government sort of withdrew the biodiesel subsidy. They were getting into more, you know, renewable energy, but the government sort of pulled the rug from under them there and said, "Oh, lignite's the future," or another few coal mines. At a time when any good analyst would know that the price of coal is going down because there's more competition, there's more use of gas instead of coal internationally. So long term, or in the medium term at least, the coal price is going to stay very low.
Julie, the government will claim that the last election gave them a mandate to sell our assets. The last election was one of the lowest voter turnouts in over a century. How legitimate is their claim of mandate when you consider that?
I think if they felt they had a legitimate mandate, they wouldn't be so scared of this referendum, and they wouldn't be rushing things to make sure they get them through before the petition signatures are counted. Yeah. You know, we've got a very real interest from the public in keeping these assets. I've worked before on citizens-initiated referendum campaigns, and it's really hard to get the signatures. This is one of the few issues where pretty much everybody you ask is prepared to sign. It's really more about, can you get to enough people in the time frame?
Right. And if you say, well, as Bill English said on the radio this morning, that the only referendum that counts is the election, then you're really knocking out that whole citizens-initiated referendum process. And there's a basic democratic principle at stake too. Sure, the government in one sense has an election mandate and they made it part of the election policy, but people elected them on a whole range of issues.
Exactly.
So if there's an issue after an election where clearly the public is in rebellion, you've got to listen to the public and you've got to allow a referendum process as is going to be initiated by all these people that went out and gained the signatures.
What can the referendum hope to achieve now? What's the best outcome for the...
Well, if there is an overwhelming vote in the referendum against asset sales and the government doesn't listen, it will be to its own cost. It might lose the next election because of it, and it may slow up the asset sales. It looks like they won't be completed before the election, so it might have an ongoing impact and make sure that an incoming Labor Green government reverses what's gone on. Should the threat be from the opposition, we will buy these assets back if you sell them? I mean, Labor is saying, look, that's pretty risky to go that far. New Zealand First wanting to take that step.
I think that's another way that the referendum could be really valuable because it could shape that opposition and in this case, hopefully, future government policy. I think we've seen Labor has reacted recently on a number of other things like charter schools, for example. They're considering whether they would, which interestingly is something the government had no mandate for because it wasn't even in their policy. So don't seem to be too worried about mandate most of the time. But Labor is toying with, and I believe may have even said now, that they will bring any charter schools, they'll bring them back into the state system. And so really the referendum is a very important way for people to put pressure on Labor to make a commitment to a plan at least to bring those assets back into state.
Final word to both of you. I mean, the valuation is $5 to $7 billion. Where do you think it's going to come now?
Well, I'm not a specialist in that area, but it won't be $7 billion. It won't be anywhere near it. And one of the hidden factors is whether there's going to be renewal of the Southland aluminium processing contract, because if that drops out, then there's going to be a surplus of electricity, and that'll really reduce the price for all of these power companies.
If we're rushing everything onto market as quickly as possible, desperate buyers don't get good prices.
That's right. You know,
less than 5 billion?
motivated seller.
Yeah, motivated seller.
No, I think it's going to come in well under 5 billion. I mean, like Keith, it's not an area of expertise for me, but I think these are pie in the sky figures, and they also don't take into account loss of earnings from dividends. They don't take into account there will still be issues to resolve around Māori rights to water, and that will put the price down further.
The court did say that we're watching, didn't they?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, it's difficult to top the smelly revelations in Key's Pokies for Convention Centre deal, but the government managed that this week when emails around the Hobbit were released under the Official Information Act. Turns out the entire event was an anti-union bashing manufactured crisis after emails exposed New Line Cinema assuring the government that they would not take the movie offshore. Keith, Helen Kelly and Robin Malcolm both face death threats over this. Who should be apologising to the union movement first, the mainstream media or the government?
Well, there's a whole lot of people who should be apologising, because what these emails confirm is that all the players knew that as of a big march that took place in Wellington, I was an MP, it went past my office. I walked out on the street, Lambton Quay, saw all these people coming past with Richard Taylor, Peter Jackson's offsider at the head, yelling, lift the boycott, lift the boycott. And we know from these emails, because this march was on October the 20th, 2010, that a few days before that,
it had been lifted.
The boycott had been lifted. The union was put under a confidentiality agreement. And so Peter Jackson and the government, through the emails he sent to the government, and New Line Cinema, all knew that the union action had finished. And yet they allowed a march to go ahead and then used that in a propaganda way, saying that the union had somehow stopped the film coming to New Zealand, when that was no longer an issue. And the only two issues in the New Line Cinema press emails show this were, one, are we going to get a big chunk of money out of the government? They eventually got about 100 million, I think it added up to. And are you going to change the law to make sure there's no union involvement or strikes? And they managed that as well. Or the emails in this sort of cosy, matey relationship in a secret manner, it's good it's been brought out in the open. And one thing that does show that's important is to protect our Official Information Act. Because what they're proposing now, are sort of slightly parallel with an independent in this, is to increase the withholding information on the basis of commercial secrecy. And that was the very reason they gave, and eventually the Ombudsman David Mee overruled this, but they said, well, you can't release all this stuff because it's commercially secret.
That's right.
And in fact, what they were doing, one of the emails, for instance, the first issue of it, they cut off the fact it was Peter Jackson, and they cut off the sentence that said that the union boycott was over. The two critical bits of information that would embarrass the government. So, and they used that under the banner of commercial secrecy.
Julie, if Helen Clark had lied to the people in the manner the government has over the Hobbit, the New Zealand Herald would be publishing her address with recipes for Molotov cocktails alongside it. Is there a double standard when it comes to John Key? He seems to be able to get away with this without any problems.
Well, I think we certainly saw that in the first term. I think we are starting to see a turn now. We had Vernon Small wrote an article basically saying about the Sky City deal, this is before the Hobbit revelations, that it was too smelly. And that's a mainstream political commentator from the Herald saying it's too smelly, you need to do the process again. That's quite significant. I think though that with the Hobbit situation, I don't think people have fully comprehended the significance of it yet. And the thing that really chills me is that Brownlee and Finlayson wrote a letter saying, we don't think we should change the Employment Relations Act, and these are our reasons why we don't think that's necessary. But then they did it anyway, and now they can't remember why. And the quality of decision making, if you can't remember why you made such a significant decision, why you changed your mind on something so significant, particularly to the union movement in New Zealand, that's very poor decision making, and we must expect better.
Keith, after spending so much political treasure framing the unions as the instigators and the problem here, when John Key got into that room with those executives, he had to give them anything they asked for because the value he'd put into it was so high. Does this suggest that he's not really the great deal maker? I mean, if we look at the Pokies deal as another example, it turns out that the taxpayer is going to have to pick up for Sky City's promotion budget, for crying out loud. I mean, the myth is that he's this great deal maker. Is he perhaps not all that good?
Yeah, well, if you give too much ground to your what is supposed to be your negotiating partner, then you will end up with a deal that's to your own disadvantage. And the sense I get from all the materials that have come out under the Official Information Act is that it's so matey. There's so close a relationship between National Party politicians and some of these corporate leaders that they sort of do the deal without it being a proper negotiation, just almost a good turn for some sort of future benefit or some sort of future support. It's at the edge of corruption in that sense, if it's for future political benefit, even though there's no money changing hands. You know, there's lobbying advantages and all the rest of it. And I think that's what worries me, because New Zealand is a small, sort of socially intertwined society where this matiness plays a role in a lot of our social, political, economic life. And it can go two ways. On the one hand, it can reduce corruption by people spotting something funny's going on through different matey networks. But it can actually encourage corruption by too much sort of I'll pat your back, you pat mine going on. And that's why we need the proper processes. That's why I think the Vernon Small and people like that have written about it, to say we need to keep to the processes. It's very important in our small, matey society.
Julie, is it a disgrace that our Prime Minister doesn't seem to factor any of the social damage that these 300 pokies are going to wreak upon Auckland to build a convention centre? That just for him, that's just not part of the equation? I think they see it as quite irrelevant. Which I find astonishing, particularly when we know that pokies are the major gateway to problem gambling, that something like around half of the income from pokies is estimated to come from problem gamblers. You know, just the corrosive, destructive, there's no skill element to it. You know, it's not like bingo where there is a slight skill element, a lot of it's still luck. You know, pokies, it really is corrosive, and I just don't think they care all that much. The point that Keith was making about how matey things are, I really get the sense with Key is that he's forgotten who he's doing these deals for. He is focused on doing these deals in a short-term political sense for the gain of himself and his colleagues in National. He's forgotten that he's the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and actually he's doing these deals for us. And as such, he needs to get better outcomes, frankly. Final question of both of you. Will any of this dent John Key's soaring popularity?
I think gradually it eats away at it amongst thinking people, and most people are thinking. Yeah, he's got away with a lot by being the chatty, friendly sort of guy and bending a bit here and there. But I think there will be a corrosive influence on National's popularity and John Key's own popularity.
When does it start affecting him? I mean, he seems to be Teflon. I
know. It gets very depressing as a lefty watching the polling results. I think it's partly because the alternative is not articulated well enough yet. I think that will come over time. So at the moment, people are still supporting Key because they think he's an okay person. Some of this stuff, it's other people's hands who are dirty, but I don't see how he's going to avoid it with Sky City. And the other one that I think will be very interesting to watch is the Whanganui Collegiate decision, where the Minister was effectively told by Cabinet, think again, you should integrate this school as opposed to allowing this prestigious private school to close.
Yes.
And it seems that the exact same reasons that they kept Whanganui Collegiate open are the reasons that they rebuffed for the Christchurch schools who want to stay open.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. Speaking of soaring popularity, TV3's Reid Research poll came out claiming National had over 50% popularity. Of course, this is the very same poll that was out by as much as 6% in the month of the 2011 election. But has David Shearer's reshuffle done enough to challenge National? Julie, Charles Cheval's final speech last night in Parliament attacked Labour for hunting the enemy within and called for the old guard to step down. the reshuffle hasn't really calmed a lot of those tensions yet, has it?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things in the reshuffle I think people have missed a bit is bringing Cunliffe back into, albeit relatively minor, economic roles. The revenue role is actually very significant because capital gains tax is a key is a key policy for Labor, and a lot of the other things they want to do hinges off that. So revenue, him having revenue is quite important.
So you think that was a olive branch?
Definitely. I think the other really significant thing is now that he's got those policies back, he's back in the economic policy restructuring that's happening within Labor. So he's back on those teleconferences, he's back in there looking at those chapters in the policy manifesto, and that's actually quite significant. So we'll be interested to see how that plays out.
Leanne Dalziel, slap in the face?
I think she's done a really good job in Christchurch. I think there have been some messages sent to MPs who've been around a while of you need to start thinking about succession, and I think she's probably one of those.
That message didn't get through to Annette King though, did it? Keith, is this a reshuffle or a regurgitation?
I think they have put some more competent people in some key positions.
Phil Twyford's a good step?
Yeah, in housing, well, Annette King is reasonably competent at health, and Grant Robinson in the jobs. Chris Hipkins, well, he'll be an improvement in the education area anyhow. I do worry about the economic area that Julie talked about, and it's good that Cunliffe's in there, but David Parker's pretty conventional way he looks at the Reserve Bank role, etc., and then I see the duo of Phil Goff and Clayton Cosgrove running the trade policy, the sort of free marketeers, free trade and investment. They'll be supporting the Trans-Pacific Partnership 100%. So whether there'll be a fundamental change in Labor's economic policy. So I think it's important, if we're to get a Labor Green government, to present it as such, because the Greens are going to add a lot of the oomph in the economic, environmental and other areas, and if it's just presented as a Labor government or a Labor-led government, then people are going to say, oh, this is sort of status quo economics, and why do I want to shift from key? You know, so you know that combo of Labor and Greens is important. And I am a, you know, Leanne Dalziel, she has gone through hell, you know, personally and politically in Christchurch, worked very hard, quite a competent person. So I do feel a little bit for her, maybe because she was supporting Cunliffe, that, you know, she lost a bit more than she should have. Well, that's certainly the suggestion that Charles has come up with. Final question to both of them: is this the new shadow cabinet for the next government? I mean, is this who we are looking at from 2014, who's going to lead the country? I think that's very much how it's being framed, and I think that's good that Labor are framing it that way, that Cher has been repeatedly saying this is a shadow cabinet. I think something I hadn't thought about until Keith just mentioned it now is how will the Greens fit into that, and that perhaps that might be part of Cher's thinking in the way he's carved up some of the jobs. I don't know. But I think one of the key things for me is the promotion of Hipkins to the education role when he's still quite young, and I know Hipkins from university days, and whether he would be able to step up to be a minister in the next round, and whether people will take that. I mean, I think probably he could, but it doesn't necessarily look that way from the outside. Why has Labor just not been able to do anything on the health front? When there was so much going on in health, and I hear from people all the time, there's real bloody problems going on in funding now. Tony Ryle just seems to be a magician. It's like he's got Teflon on his hands. He's just incredible. Annette King, of course, being a former Minister of Health, knows where all the bodies are buried, and I think it's been quite good to move her back into the role. Marion Street's someone I have an enormous amount of respect for. I think there's been a general sense that perhaps she's not really an opposition politician in that sense of being able to go head to head, to ferret out those issues, bring them to light. She's more of someone who's more solution focused, and so I think that's probably been a good choice. So expect a new front under Annette? I think so. If we're talking about the 2014 cabinet, it's got to be a Green cabinet, surely, doesn't it? If the ratio of votes is 2 Labor to 1 Green, then a third of the cabinet, including the third of the more important positions in cabinet, have to be Green. So it can't just be greenwash, it's got to be a genuine Green cabinet. Yeah, it would have to be a genuine Green involvement with a lot of concessions to Green Party policy, you know, and Labor's going to find, and hopefully it will be a real thing come 2014. Labor's going to find it very hard to get away from this whole you know, we are the leading party, and you're sort of a
tag
tag on.
Right,
yeah.
you are the third largest party.
You've got to see
you
it
want to see
as
some real...
a true Labour Green government has a massive green policy
Right.
and political and ministerial involvement in it.
Let's wrap the show with final word. Keith, your final word this week is?
Well, I've been looking at the Royal Succession Bill that's before Parliament, coming up for
yes.
its first reading probably next week or the week after, and it has a positive thing about it in that apparently the heir to the throne can now marry a Catholic, but still cannot be a Catholic. This is because it's a carbon copy of a British bill and they want to keep the monarch as head of the Church of England.
Right.
And it just struck me as rather odd that, you know, we're all over Richard Prosser saying Muslims can't get on aeroplanes, and yet this bill preserves a process, and it could easily be changed, whereby no Muslim can inherit the throne. In fact, nobody who's not of the Protestant religion or an atheist or whatever. And there's got to be a change in the legislation when it comes before Parliament, or it shows really the problems of us keeping a head of state as a monarch on the other side of the world who's rooted in the Protestant English tradition and is not even a New Zealander.
Julie, your final word this week?
I just wanted to talk about the minimum wage being increased by a massive 25 cents,
Wow.
to $13.75 an hour. They're looking at bringing in, again, youth rates at $10.80 an hour. We've had a living wage calculation released, which is $18.40 an hour. And the minimum wage in Australia is the equivalent of New Zealand $19.60 an hour. So it's just not good enough, and you know, it is simply not fair that there are people who have to live on a minimum wage that is just not livable. They are worth more than that, and they deserve a better deal.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Keith. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word. This whole sorry, smelly Hobbit mess where we rewrote our labour laws for a foreign corporation and the ease with which so many New Zealanders were manipulated into becoming an anti-union lynch mob should really kick some Kiwis up the bum for their unquestioning consumption of mainstream media spin. I love how any criticism of The Hobbit is shouted down by National as Hobbit hating. Let's get this straight, shall we? I'm not a Hobbit hater, Mr. Key. I hate cronyism, corporate welfare, and anti-union hysteria. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.